Welcome friends, and after a long time I'm here with a new episode where we explore the thought of Jahm ibn Ṣafwān, a pivotal figure in early Islamic theology. As the first to articulate a systematic theological vision grounded in reason and empiricism, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān stands at the crossroad of the Quranic interpretation, Greek philosophy, and the rise of the natural theology in Islam. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān is the first Muslim theologian in the full and proper sense. His theology is part of his empiricism grounded in Aristotle's theory of knowledge or the ilm. And with him starts the conflict between Muslim natural theology and a literalistic reading of the Quranic predicates and the attributes of God. In Muslim sources, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān and later religious scholars who are associated with his thesis and labeled by adversaries as jahamiyyah are opposed to both extremes of a spectrum of medieval Muslim religious parties. On one side of the spectrum are a notoriously subliterate and aggressive mob, hashawiyah, and anthropomorphists are those who maintaining that God is like other things, are the mushabbihah, who both educated an ignorant and non-reflective reading of the Qur'an, as well as Hanabalites and neo-Hanabalites who refuse natural theology and have been educating from the earliest time until today a literalistic reading. Hanabalites and neo-Hanabalites react extremely hostilely to Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's doctrines and call him an enemy of God who led astray and at least negatively and dangerously influenced many of the Hanafites, Mu'tazilis, Zaydis, Shiis, asharites, and even Maturidis. On the opposite side of the spectrum of the Muslim theology, the so-called Jahamiyyah is confronted with the argument of the Mu'tazilites, the strongest party of philosophically educated early Muslims. And despite their opposition to each other, all Muslim parties agree that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān is the first or among the first who introduced the principle of intellect or al-aql and the method of reasoning to derive opinions from the propositions in Islam. Hanabalites say that he drew on the principles of the pagan Greek philosophy, which he borrowed from the Hellenistic philosophers, Christian heretics, and Jews. However, they are not precise and do not specify from which persons, school of thoughts, or stands of thinking Jahm and Jahamites borrowed their theses and arguments. And one of the famous Western scholars argued that Jahm's system manifests itself as clearly and unambiguously Neoplatonic in structure and content. And he based his argument on the parallels between the Jahm's thesis and Platonism, and it is in particular on Jahm's distinction between God and things or the ashia. It can hardly be denied that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān drew an ancient and late ancient discussions between Platonists, Peripateticians, Stoics, and Epicureans on the relationship between the incorporeal and the corporeal, the active and the passive. Jahm's physics and ontology are grounded on his basic distinction between the existent, corporeal, or al-jism al-mawjood, and the incorporeal, which is either other than the body, or the ghayr al-jism, or non-existent, or the ma'doom, ma laysa bi-mawjood. The existent corporeal hence is opposed to both the existent incorporeal and the non-existent non-corporeal. Causal efficacy can be assigned to the incorporeal existent only, and then the potency belongs to the corporeal agency to the incorporeal. Knowledge is grounded on the existent corporeal only because only this can be an object of the perception, knowledge, or estimation. And these aspects only to some extent are in line with the Middle Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition. They contain an anti-Platonic element which is crucial for Jahm's epistemology, his ontology, and his theology. In the Jahamite system, there are no immaterial existent and cause except God. The Jahamites refuse the existence of incorporeal composite things and maintain that the only one incorporeal, incomposite, and active principle can be proven to existent, or we can say that is God, and who is cause of all things, which is itself uncaused and necessarily exists, given that the corporeal things which came to be and pass away and change their states of being or real existing things. The epistemology of the Jahamites, including their theory that the certainty that there is a cause correlated to every alteration happens by intuition, is empiricist and based on the distinction between the concept of the formation by characteristics or the sifats abstracted from the sensible things on the one hand, and by the intuition that there must be a cause of their existence on the other hand. the refuse incorporeal objects of the God's knowledge, which entails the refusal of interpretation of the Platonic ideas as the thought of God. Now let's analyze some selected accounts of the Jahamites' doctrine, discussing them according to their central themes, and most of these reports come from the hostile sources and are often been presented without their original context. The goal here is reconstruct the integral coherence of the Jahamites' theological system. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān is supposed to have said that the God's knowledge or the ilmullah is temporally originated, or the muhdith, and he has brought into the temporal existence or in the ahdath, and by it he knows. And this knowledge is something other than a God or the ghayrullah. And according to this account or this report, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān believed that God could know all particular things or the ashya before their existence by bringing his knowledge into the existence prior to them. However, another report or another account attributed to him or attributes the opposite view to him, and it claims that Jahm stated, or the Jahm ibn Ṣafwān said, that God knows a thing only at the time of its origination, or fi hali huduthi, and it is absurd for something to be an object of the knowledge or the ma'lum while it's still being non-existent, or the ma'lum. And this statement is based on the Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's definition of ashya or ashay, or an existent body, or al-jism al-mawjood. And according to him, what doesn't exist, ma laysa bi mawjood, is not a shay at all, and thus cannot be known or unknown, or fayu'lam aw yujhal. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's adversaries used this reasoning to challenge him. They argued that his premises logically led to the conclusion that God's knowledge or the ilmullah must be muhdith or temporally originated, and according to them, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's argument implied at the first that God was not knowing, or kana ghayru alimin, and then he came to know thumma alim. And by extension, they argued that if Jahm ibn Ṣafwān held this view of divine knowledge or the ilmullah, he must also extend it to divine power or the divine qudra and life, means or implying that the God's power and life are likewise muhdath or temporally originated. And unlike the hostile Hanbali sources, Al-Ash'ari attempts to present Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's thesis in a neutral manner. His reports includes the reduction to absurdity or the ilzam al-hujjah argument, where Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's opponents highlight the contradiction in his reasoning. And however, the narrative doesn't clearly differentiate between Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's own view and the consequences his adversaries attributed to him. However, comparing this report with the other sources reveals that it actually reflects the conclusion drawn by Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's opponents rather than Jahm's own beliefs. And in fact, other accounts clearly state that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān didn't consider God's knowledge or the ilmullah to be separate from him or the ghayrullah, but rather the opposite. The key issue is the nature of God's knowledge or the ilmullah and its relation to the creation. Specifically, if we could say that, does God know only the particular corporeal things, al-ashya al-jismaniyya, or does he know only the universal intelligible concepts, or the al-ashya al-ma'qula, or does he know both? Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's opponents argued that since he rejected the idea that God's knowledge pertains to immaterial concept prior to the material existence, he was logically forced to admit that God's knowledge depends on the material objects similar to the human knowledge, or the ilm kasabi. They accused him of implying that God's knowledge is empirical, acquired through the induction or the istiqra. Since all the material objects are generated or the muhdath, because every composite things or the murakkab is created, they argued that the God's knowledge or ilmullah or its power, the qudra and creative activity or his fail must also be muhdath or temporally generated. And this would mean that God undergoes the changes. Before creation, before the khalq, he would be unknowing, and only after creation would his knowledge come into being. And this conclusion contradicts the widely accepted theological principle that God doesn't undergo substantial or qualitative changes, or the taghayyur. And according to Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's second supposition, existent body, al-jism al-mawjood, is defining characteristic of things, or the shay. He maintains, or he said, that apart from the corporeal things, there are no knowable entities, or the ma'lumat. Anything that doesn't exist at a specific time and place and lacks particular qualities means what is either non-existent or ma'doom, or God Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indiscernible and therefore cannot be an object of the knowledge or the ma'loom or ignorance or the majhul. So the key question is how Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's two additional suppositions should be understood. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's opponents interpreted his first supposition as God knows a thing only at the time of its origination or the fi hali huduth. And what is it? Non-existent. It's neither a thing nor a knowable or the ma'loom. And their understanding was based on a temporal approach which led them to the conclusions we discussed. These opponents likely belong to a group that affirmed the eternity of the things along with their creator, or yuthbit qidam al-ashya ma'a bariyaha. And they held that the God has always been knowing, lam yazal aliman. And they argued that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's position implied a contradiction between the being eternally knowing, aliman azalan, and being knowing through the origination or aliman bihuduth, in concluding that the Jahm ibn Ṣafwān consider God's knowledge to be temporally originated or muhdath. However, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān neither affirmed that the God's knowledge is eternal or the qadim, and nor it is generated through origination or muhdath. He likely understood his first supposition as that God knows a thing in the condition of its origination or the fi hali huduth, which means that God knows what it is and how it is and where it exists and which properties belong to it at the moment it exists, and without reference to the past, present, or the future. Similarly, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān probably understood his third supposition as that which never exists or what didn't exist, does not exist, and will not exist in experimental reality, is neither knowable and nor a thing. Under these conditions, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān held that the God's knowledge or the God knows all particular things or the ashya juziyyah all of all times without any relation to the moment of their temporal origination. The Mu'tazilite opponents of the Jahm ibn Ṣafwān use the term thing or the shay not only for the corporeal ajsam but also for the immaterial entities, which include substances or the jawahir, an accident or the arad, and activities or the af'al, categories or the ajnaz such as the categories of the colors, alwan, movements or the harakat, and test or the adwaq. Abbad ibn Sulaiman affirmed that the such things are the ashya are the object of the God's knowledge, are the ma'lumatullah, and God's power are the maqduratullah, that even prior to the creation of the particular composite bodies are al-ajsam al-murakkaba. And in contrast, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān rejected the reality of the universal substances or the jawahirul kulliyah, and the a'rad or the accident, and the activities or the af'al, and he regarded them as mere thoughts and concepts or the afkar wa ma'ani rather than ontologically real entities or the ashya wujudiyah. From Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's perspective, thoughts and realities are fundamentally opposed. Concepts exist in the mind, but they do not correspond to the real external existence or the wujud kharaji. His epistemology placed corporeal qualities or the sifat jismiya and physical actions or the af'al jismiya as the primary basis of knowledge, and denying that abstracts universal and any independent existence. In such a way, we could say that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's legacy is both foundational and controversial. His bold integration of reason, his critique of literalism, and his radically empirical view of the divine knowledge set the stage for centuries of the theological debate. Whether praised or vilified, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's influence remains undeniable in shaping of Islamic intellectual history.